Joining us for Insight is Loren Steffy. You've worked for the Houston Chronicle and Texas Monthly covering business and the energy sector. Boone Pickens was a big part of that world.
He was a huge part of that world, and for a period of time, he really almost embodied that world. In the 1980s, when the oil business was going through this huge restructuring, and you saw a big resurgence in oil prices and in drilling, especially in the early part of the decade, Boone really was kind of the personification of a lot of that. If you remember, Dallas was the most popular show on TV, and he was sort of the business answer to that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, what made him such a force when it came to business? What was different about him?
There was kind of a level of audacity there that is sort of incredible when you think about it, but what he figured out was that the oil business is a very tough business. It's very risky. You put a lot of money at risk drilling a hole in the ground, and you hope you're going to find oil, and if you don't, you lose a lot of money. And so that's kind of always been the nature of the business, and if you're a gambler, that's had a lot of appeal, right? But what he figured out was, as the industry got bigger, as the demand for oil got bigger, these numbers kept getting bigger, and he sat down and figured out what it would cost to drill enough wells to replace all the oil he was producing, and he came up with a number, and he realized that it was a lot cheaper to buy reserves that somebody else had already drilled than it was to try to find them himself. And that was a concept that really nobody had thought through, and it led to what became known as the takeover game, the corporate raids of the 1980s. But there was really kind of this huge restructuring of capital, and he was at the forefront of it.
You can probably go to many schools and see his name on the buildings because he's funded so much. And how did he really build his legacy? It goes beyond just that.
It really does. I mean, he really didn't make his huge fortune until he was in his mid-70s, really until he built a company. The company had bet very heavily on natural gas. He ultimately lost the company, and then he started over when he was in his late 60s, and he built a hedge fund, a successful investing operation, and that's when he made his first billion. And so from there, it's kind of like if you're at that age and your family's grown, and what do you do with all this money? And his answer was, well, I'll give it all away. And really, he wanted to give a lot of it away during his lifetime, which you've seen more and more philanthropists do because they want to be able to control where the money goes.
We saw Governor Abbott and George W. Bush pay tribute. What was Boone Pickens' legacy when it comes to politics in Texas?
He was obviously a very strong supporter of the Republican Party and Republican candidates. He was one of the biggest donors, I believe, to Clayton Williams during his run for governor back in the 90s, and you saw that really carry through for most Republican candidates. There were a few that he wasn't quite as big on, but he was a huge supporter of George W. Bush. So you saw a lot of support at both the state and the federal level for Republican causes.
You interviewed him last year when he was 90. What was he like then, and how do you think he wanted to be remembered?
I did talk to him last year. Actually, I went out to see him at his ranch in West Texas, and I noticed a little bit of decline in his health. He'd had a few strokes and whatnot, but he was still very sharp. And it was interesting because his original childhood home has been relocated to the ranch. And at one point, we were sitting in his living room from where he grew up, and he just started telling all these stories of his childhood, and everything was coming back to him. One of the things that always impressed me about Boone was he just had a very sharp mind. He could remember numbers that just random things. I gave the example in the article for Texas Monthly about we were debating the number of acres of the Matador Ranch in West Texas, and he nailed it. It was just kind of a random conversation. So. There was a second part of that I...
Yeah, I guess, what do you think he wanted his legacy to be, and what do you see as his legacy?
I think that he wanted to be remembered as a philanthropist, primarily, and as somebody that did a lot of good with the money with the wealth that he was able to amass. I think he believed a lot in the American ideal of entrepreneurship and success and, being rewarded for that. I think his legacy really goes beyond that. I think, as a business writer, when you look at what happened in the 1980s, and I mentioned that realignment of capital, I think that Boone Pickens was at the forefront of this kind of democratization of capital and investments. It was right at the time that we started getting 401k plans, and we all became much more involved. We sort of realized if we're ever going to retire, we need to be actively investing, we need to be in the market. And you saw an opening up of things like index funds, and more and more individual investors were coming into the market. And what Boone saw, before anybody else did really, really was that there were a lot of companies that really weren't managed that well, and the value was not coming back to the shareholders. And so he kind of gave us this idea that the shareholders are the owners of the company, that you know, when you hear companies talk about maximizing shareholder value, there's a direct line from that phrase back to what Boone Pickens did. So it really transformed our view of the markets and investment and capital in a very significant way.
Loren Steffy, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.